So Concord is shutting down after only 2 weeks of running. Does it seem like the math has changed for live service games? Does it seem like they're getting less of a chance to catch on before developers are pulling the service out of the live service? To some degree, this is true. The reality is that in order to fix a live service that isn't working, you need to potentially put in a lot of work. You might need to add brand new game modes. You need to rebalance it. You need to add new content. You might need to change the entire art style. And this is a cost that you have to be willing to spend in order to potentially fix this live service. If you are an independent studio all on your own, then to some degree you have no choice. If there's any glimmer that you could possibly save this, it's going to be a necessity for you to pull out all the stops and try to fix it. You probably don't have deep enough reserves to abandon it and build another game from scratch. So a lot of earlier live services, which were built by studios that were independent or semi-independent from larger publishers, lived in this space. A lot of the early mobile live services were like this. The games were built by independent studios who didn't have infinite cash reserves. So the games came out, they hit as well as they did, and then the studio invested months or sometimes even years into fixing the service and making it start to chug along and work better and better until some of these things became juggernauts. And there have been examples of this happening within larger organizations as well. Final Fantasy XIV launched, came down, was fixed, and came back up again, and now is a huge MMO. But in the case of larger organizations, larger studios that exist within larger publishing organization, this do or die doesn't exist. There are things that you could have people work on if they're not working to fix this live service. You do have the reserves to handle shutting down this service. It doesn't have to work. So there's less pressure to fix it at any cost. Indeed, there's an opportunity cost to chasing this live service, because if people are working on this game, they're not working on another game that doesn't have as much negative connotation within the organization around it. When you look at what happened with Mass Effect Andromeda post-release content, the people who were supposed to be working on that post-release content were sucked up into other parts of the EA organization because an argument was made that it wasn't worthwhile to chase this opportunity, even if that potentially would have helped fix the underlying game, even if it would have repaired the reputation of that game. Because to a certain degree, within a larger organization, there's always a battle going on for money, for people, for attention. The sniff of failure can be a death knell within these larger companies. Because if I'm trying to steal resources from you and you're about to come out, that's basically impossible. But if you just came out and things aren't going quite as well as you hoped, well, now you're weak and I'm able to come in and eat up your resources, steal your resources for my own needs, for the things that I'm trying to work on. To some degree, a lot of times it's a zero-sum game. So one game is fighting over resources with another game. So when one game has a problem, that can very quickly spiral into that game, that studio losing control of its people. As these large organizations become more interconnected, as people work on more things across a wider array of studio, I think that's going to actually become more and more common. In the past, when the physical location of a person was super important, if you were in Sweden, you were going to work with the team that was in Sweden. It was harder for other parts of the organization to come along and snatch up your people. So the competition largely exists within the smaller studio, within the bigger organization. But these days, as we've adapted more and more to remote work, to hybrid work environments, that's become less and less true. Now, if you were working on Battlefield yesterday in Sweden, you could work on Football Club in Vancouver the next day without moving, because you just simply join a different Slack server and you're good to go. And in some ways that's great, because it means that there's less feast and famine within these studios. Studios don't need to figure out how to keep everyone busy or be threatened with layoffs. But now it also means that instead of there being maybe one other project in competition for your people, now there might be 10 or 20 projects in competition for your people. And so the appetite for stumbling and then taking the time to fix that stumble becomes less and less. Indeed, it isn't even necessarily that it is stumbling. It could just be making money too slowly. A live service that is actually making money, that is actually paying its own way, covering its own costs, and making a profit, can still get shut down within a larger organization because it isn't making enough money, because the ROI isn't good enough, because the opportunity cost is seen as being too great. The way that public companies tend to be run is they want to spend $1 and get a certain multiple of $1 or more back on the money that they spend. So if you are an independent studio and you've launched a live service and you have 50 people supporting that live service, and you are making the cost of those people, their salaries and their equipment and the office space and all that stuff, and you're paying for the live service, and you're making 10% extra, you're probably pretty happy. Your studio is able to keep working, is able to keep existing while you support this live service. But if you are a publicly traded company, you might look at that and go, that's just a 10% return. We want a 30% return. We want a 60% return. And so this isn't good enough. So what could seem to be a successful enough live service can actually be seen as a failure within these larger organizations. Unless you've kind of been immersed in this economic culture, this kind of is hard to make any sense of. Why are we shutting down something that is making money? And frankly, it kind of doesn't make any sense, but that is the way that a lot of these companies actually run. Something that is making money, that is turning a profit, that is bringing more cash into the reserves of the corporation, can be seen as actually making their financial situation worse. There have been examples of big publishers taking the time to fix a problem. Final Fantasy XIV launched really roughly and was taken down, fixed, and now is a huge MMO. But that was a while ago, and Final Fantasy had already shown that it could have a successful MMO. Final Fantasy was a well-established brand, so there was more appetite to try to repair that, in part because there was no desire to do permanent damage to that IP, because at the very least, you wanted to make sure that Final Fantasy wasn't tarnished as a brand. Same thing with Fallout 76. You want Fallout to still be viable as a brand. So you're willing to spend more time, you're willing to invest the resources to try to fix that service. But both of these examples are getting a little long in the tooth. We've seen a lot of more recent examples when live service games have come out, not clicked with their audience, and then been abandoned relatively quickly. Concord is an extreme example. 2 weeks is incredibly short. But we have lots of other examples in the last year where games have come out and been set aside by their support staff very quickly. Sony is trying to make 6 live services in the next year. Concord is one of those. What's going on? The math underlying all of this continues to be basically the same. A successful live service can make way more money than a single player game. A successful live service also has a nice, long, fat tail of money. So on your balance sheet, it smooths everything out, which the street loves because they love consistent revenue, as opposed to these spikes that you get from traditional video game publishing. I think what's changing is now there's a little bit more realization that this is a bit of a lottery ticket, that every live service isn't going to hit. So what's happening is we're just throwing a lot of darts at the dartboard, hoping to get a bullseye. And I think that the calculus is that if it takes 10 darts to get one bullseye, that's worth it, even if those other 9 games end up being abandoned. A strong counterexample to what's happening with Concord is what's happening with Deadlock from Valve. I would argue that that's actually being developed in a way that looks a lot more like the way that live services were developed in the past, where it's being developed very slowly, it's being kept kind of behind wraps. Currently, access is by invite only, but it's being allowed to build itself up, slowly strengthen its underlying mechanics so that eventually it will come out and should come out relatively strongly. You see this in what's happening with its numbers. Its numbers are slowly climbing as opposed to rapidly declining, which is what we see with a large number of these live services. I don't know that the big publishers are prepared to work that way. Releasing games in earlier states, working with a small community and slowly growing over time is a much more vulnerable way to develop. You're exposing yourself to a lot more, a lot earlier. But I do think that if we want to have a greater chance of succeeding with a live service, it's a much better way to go. Finally, the reality is that we're pretty saturated on live services. People who are interested in extraction shooters mostly already have an extraction shooter that they're playing. People who are interested in looter shooters probably already have a looter shooter that they're playing. People who play MMOs have an MMO. So unless you are coming out with a live service that's going to create a brand new subgenre in live services, you have to be good enough to dethrone, to some degree, for some people, the existing king of that space. And that's a really hard thing to do. Live services are very sticky because they involve interaction with other people. To get me to stop playing Destiny, you also have to get most of my friends to stop playing Destiny as well. So it's a much higher bar to cross. You need to get me to not just give it a try, you need to get me to set aside the existing habitual live service that I already have. It's not that it can't be done, but it's a lot harder to do than it was in the past. Destiny was coming into a world where there basically weren't any looter shooters. There was Borderlands, arguably, but effectively the genre didn't exist. So you were able to attract a group of people who probably didn't really have a live service game in their catalog. So now they were picking up Destiny, and Destiny was slotting into that spot. And then Division could come in and get a slightly different group of people. As the market saturated, all these different games were able to jockey for position in different sub parts of the group. But to a large degree, that space is now covered. Bungie is now working on Marathon, which is an extraction shooter. So unlike with Destiny, where they were coming into a blue ocean, which was largely uncompetitive, and they were able to come in, have a pretty rough launch, frankly, Destiny 1, and then able to very quickly fix that and establish themselves as the one to beat in the looter shooter space. In the extraction shooter space, there are a lot of players there already. So you need to be able to dethrone at least a few of those in order to build your market. And it'll be interesting to see if Bungie's able to do that. When the market is relatively empty, games that are competently executed can actually do really well because they are different just by existing. But in spaces that either have very tight feature sets or are very saturated, competent isn't good enough. A competent first person shooter doesn't stand apart from all of the other first person shooters and therefore can't really succeed. A competent looter shooter is just lost in the noise. Why am I going to leave my other very competent looter shooter in order to play yours? You need to stand apart in some way. It might be one feature, it might be aesthetic, it has to be something. So a game like Concord, which seems to be very well executed, very competently executed, doesn't have that extra oomph that brings it above the noise. And because there are already other games to play in the segment you are trying to compete in, you don't get as long of an attention span from your potential players. If you are the only player in town, people who really want this kind of game are going to stick around for longer in the hopes that you will turn this experience into something that they will enjoy. But if you are making a competitor to Destiny and it doesn't immediately grab them, why won't they just go back to Destiny? In a saturated market, not only do you need to stand apart, you also need to launch strongly enough to be sticky enough to hold on to people. While in a blue ocean environment, you are able to depend upon the patience of your players to a larger extent. This is all very mechanical, very robotic, very much ignoring the impact on the people on these teams. Because of course, the reality is having a team work on a game for 3 or 4 or 5 years, pour their hearts and souls into that endeavor, have it come out, and then not being given the time to try to make it work is soul crushing. It's very damaging. But I think within the larger organizations, the thinking remains that we have a 10% chance of one of these hitting. We'll know pretty fast if it's going to hit or not. So if it doesn't hit right away, it's not worth the effort to keep chasing that. We can take those people and put them on one of the other 9 that is going to try to hit the bullseye on the dartboard. We can put those people on other things. People are not interchangeable cogs, so there's an impact to doing that. And we'll see if in the long term you aren't squeezing the creative spark out of some of these people. But I believe that's where the thinking is coming from, is we love live services still, but we recognize that maybe they're not all going to work. We're not going to try to make them work. We'll just throw another dart. So how has the math changed? I do think that publishers still are in love with live services. They're in love with the concept of one and done games that make money for the rest of time, that have consistent revenue streams, that are able to bring in and keep customers on an ongoing basis. But I think that there's a growing realization that you don't get to have 30 of these, that you get to have 1 or 2 or 3 of these, and that most live services come in, are a flash in the pan, and fade very quickly. So what we're seeing is both a willingness to move off of live services very quickly if they don't hit very fast, but I also think a return to supporting of traditional game publishing, of games that stand on their own as complete products, are designed to be games as opposed to hobbies, are designed to come in, be played, be completed, and then set aside to make money in a contained bubble of time. I think that's really healthy. I don't know, the chasing of live services, throwing a million darts at the dartboard, not super healthy. But a return to traditional video games, I think, is great for the industry. I think that the path that we were on for a while there, where everything had to be a live service, very destructive, very unhealthy to the industry as a whole. I think we're moving into overall a more healthy place. We're going through a bit of a rocky bit as we still chase these live service revenue hoses, but I think on average, this is going to be a better place to be. So what's changed? I would argue that the thing that is the biggest change to live services today versus what we were seeing 5-10 years ago is that a larger and larger percentage of these live services are being developed inside of larger publishing organizations. Not just supported by those organizations, but actually developed inside of these organizations. And that has led to a cultural shift in the way that this is thought about. Opportunity cost of the people who are working on it is paid attention to a lot more. There is a growing recognition that live services are a bit of win or lose, and there isn't a lot of interest in having mildly successful live services that are failing or succeeding to a small degree are seen as not worth pursuing and are abandoned, and another dart is thrown at the dartboard in the hopes of getting a wildly successful live service. And we are in a much more saturated landscape. In the past, you could get away with being first to market in a lot of these spaces, or second, and grabbing a large audience simply by being there early. Now you have to actually dethrone another player in the space in order to grab a large market. And what that means is that you don't have as great of a chance. If you don't grab them right away, they move back to the other player in the space. Special thanks to my members. They provide the resources this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. Or if you are more comfortable with it, we have a Patreon as well, which is also linked in the description. You can also help the channel out by buying some merch. I'm wearing Control the Triage, Control the Project, as well as the High Tea on the High Seas hoodie. If you're interested in picking one of those up or something else, there will be a tag in this video to the store as well. What do you think? Do you think that everything can be a live service, should be a live service? Are you glad that maybe the larger publishers are starting to back away from trying to make everything into a live service? What live services do you play? Do you play Destiny? Do you play an MMO? Let's talk about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.